remember we're talking about 1983, 1984. So personal computers are just barely happening. Telecommunications is happening through modems. You go into a hotel room and you get out your screwdriver and you start messing around with the apparatus that's there to try to get yourself online so you can do email. And so everybody, it's kind of like the early years of cars. Everybody had to know how to fix the car. Everybody had to know how to mess with this stuff to make it, even semi-function. But that attitude came not only because they were doing it with their personal apparatus, they then brought that attitude to a joint aggregate community apparatus of the well. And so everybody was helping kind of build this little online town.
When I came up with the term, it was 1987, and the emphasis was really on community rather than the virtual part, because people were asking me whether anyone besides some kind of maybe anti-social electrical engineer would be interested in using computers to communicate with people. And I was very excited because what I had discovered in bulletin board systems and ultimately the well were real people who became part of my life. In fact, babysat for my daughter. I was at their weddings. I went to their funerals. I sat by their deathbeds. Anything that you do in a real community was happening with this group of people, and I wanted to get the word out that even though we met through computers, we're real people and our relationships are real.
Well, you could argue that we need that too for media and information, right? That it's impossible for anyone to take in all the information, and that's beyond anybody's competence. But how do you focus? How do you curate? In other words, how do you make a distinction between what's good information, what's bad, what's real, what's fake, what's valuable, what's something you can do without? And I think for that we need help, all of us, not just people who are perhaps less educated or something. No, but everyone. And that's a skill you have to start early with. That's not something, because media are so intimate to us, so normal, that to only start thinking about this later on, you're already so ingrained with what you're doing with your devices, you probably won't learn anything new. So what do ubiquitous media and information do to us? I think they, in general, they are making it harder for us to focus and making it difficult to come up with consensus. On the other hand, the development and especially the ridiculous success of social media fuels this need. Right? I mean, Facebook earns its money off this need and exploits this need very, very well, if you will. And if you couple that with the fact that if you're young, I mean, if you're between, let's say, younger than, let's say, 25, naturally, most of the work that you're doing about yourself is about yourself. Like most of the things you're thinking about have to do with you. So I mean, once you get older and you become more part of the world, your interests tend to shift more towards the world. But if you're younger, I mean, if you're 13, 14, 15, then the world is you. And so it's logical that younger people are much more self-revealing than older people. Well, first of all, the shift towards post-material values, which include the need to express ourselves, to tell our story, and to find that is an important part of life, is something that started in the late 1970s already. So it's not something that's caused by social media. And it has to do with rising levels of economic welfare in the world. So in other words, if you don't have to worry as much about whether you can have a roof over your head or food on the table, other things become more important, such as the environment, but also culture, the arts, and predominantly yourself. A second general reason for this has to do with the individualization of society. Who you are is much less of a given today than it was in the past, right? We have choices, we have options, and especially if you're young, those options seem endless. So the need to experiment or to explore your options or to articulate what you've chosen is much greater. And it seems to matter much more. Like back in the day, you could say, well, I want to be this, but if you were from a certain family or you lived in a certain part of the country or the world, then, well, that option just didn't exist.
The nation state and the online community have something in common, which is that they're imaginary, and that we have an image that there is some abstraction or some entity that we belong to and others belong to. Of course, I didn't invent this. There's a book called Imagined Communities. Before the internet, he was talking about nations. And you know, newspapers had a great deal to do with that. Everybody would get up and see the same headlines in the morning, and you would travel around with people who were very different from you, but you were of that nation because you all read the same headlines that day. And of course, newspapers are going away, and where are we going to get that sense? So many of the things that caused us to have a sense of coherence about nationality, I think, are disappearing.
It's a combination of a couple of findings from studies. So it's on the one hand, if you're a lazy researcher, it's the combination of two statistics. One showing that people, especially young people, over time score higher on narcissism measurement scales in psychological studies. And the other one is the uptake of social media. In other words, the number of people that have accounts on social media platforms like Facebook. And those two developments are parallel. So you can say, oh, you see, the one causes the other. In statistics, you would call that a spurious relationship. There's no real direct connection between those two things. So if you're a more advanced researcher, you would then do follow-up studies. And you ask people, for example, how do they feel when they are online? And how do they rate their presence on social media? And a lot of studies show that young people are critical about social media. They feel pressured to perform on social media. They associate being online a lot, especially on social media, with stress. So that's another variable that you can use. When you see there's an unhealthy relationship between self-image and social media presence. And that's a more compelling reason. On the other hand, you can argue that it is profoundly stressful to be young, right? I mean, from age 9 or 10 to at least age 25, 26, I mean, you are constantly changing and evolving. You have still no clear idea of who you are. Everybody seems to be looking at you. You are less likely to be in the world, to have seen much of the world. So the world is you. A kid who is 15 and in a study wouldn't say that he or she is stressed about their identity. I don't believe. Right? It's stressful. So logically, if you then ask them about how they feel on social media, they will say, yeah, it's stressful. So again, a spurious relationship. Now, I think what you can say is that social media do what all media do to us, which is they amplify what's already there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's the dark side, right? That the algorithms of social media platforms, the privileging of liking something and not saying, I hate this. There's all kinds of subtle ways in which these interfaces and these platforms steer us towards showing and expressing a specific version of human beings. And that version is not real, right? It's a censored version. It's a Star Trek version. Like in Star Trek, everybody is always dressed cleanly and it's everything is perfect. Everybody knows what they're doing, and nobody says fuck or shit. And it's like, it's scary, right? It's like it's like an advertisement. So the messy part of who we are gets erased. And that can become something you don't think about because it's, you just use it. So in that sense, there's a lot to be said for, media literacy in schools and teaching and education and discussion about who are we in media and how comfortable are we representing only a version of ourselves in media, and how do we negotiate that? That needs to be an ongoing active discussion. Otherwise, it could lead into a territory where you have to live up to the version of yourself that you made in media, but that version is a censored one. And so all of a sudden you cannot be who you really are. You have to be, like if you have a certain type of LinkedIn profile and you go on a job market, and you use that as your resume, then everybody will look at, no, so why aren't you not more like your LinkedIn profile, right? You cannot really tell any other story about yourself anymore. That would be the risk of sharing your life online. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but if you do it without thinking, then you will become, if I say it dramatically, a slave to the system. And the system is these platforms, they benefit from happy feelings. And because that's, sorry if I go on, but a good example is the reason why you don't see soda commercials around news programs on television. Like if a television news show ends, you don't see a commercial for Coca-Cola. Is because Coca-Cola found out that news makes people depressed. And then your advertisement with young people on a beach dancing and drinking Coca-Cola, people are pissed off. And that's what's going on Facebook. Facebook is dependent on advertising. People are more likely to click on and buy stuff through advertising if they are happy and if they're smiling and if they think something is funny. And so that's why these platforms are prefer you to be happy all the time and to be smiling and to be successful. And that's what they trigger you to share.
Yeah.